So the 11th century, the years from 1000 to 1100, several things are happening, and I'm going to move fairly rapidly. I want to get to Bernard, and I hope we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes to deal with him before we're done, but it means I need to cut through quite a bit of stuff here fairly quickly. So patience. If I seem a little breathless, I'm trying not to be, but several things happen that are quite important. One of the first that we want to notice is the split that takes place between the East and the West. I think you're aware that there has been now for some time a kind of working split already in place. Clear back with Constantine. Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople, renaming, of course, Byzantium by the name Constantinople. And that functionally made the capital of the empire that city, which was to the east. It wasn't too many decades later that Rome actually fell, 476, and the western side of the Roman Empire basically dissolves. The Eastern Empire remained intact, and so you have a purported Eastern emperor, an emperor of the Roman Empire, ruling, however, from Constantinople for the next several centuries, with a certain degree of balance and stability, and I won't say tranquility, but at least there was a kind of sort of a stability, as I say, about it. In the West, not so much. You have a very significant decentralizing of authority and a certain amount of chaos. Clovis comes along, unites the Frankish world. That realizes its ultimate expression in Charlemagne. You have the Holy Roman Empire that we talked about last week. All of these things are happening. Attempts, as it were, to reconstitute a unified Western world, but to some degree it's only limited in its success. During this process, the Pope is becoming an increasingly political figure. I don't want to blame him for this, because in some ways, who else is going to do it? You see, you have enough kind of tumultuous circumstances going on that the Pope, maybe even as a practical matter, simply had to insert himself into the political processes of the time. But this did take on a somewhat different character when the Papal States were created by Pepin. And all of a sudden, the Pope really is now not only a religious leader, but a political leader of a pretty good-sized piece of real estate there in Italy. And he is now among peers. He is not only a religious leader, but he's also angling for political advantages among the other political leaders there in the West. And that begins to change, in my opinion, the complexion of the papacy. And as we move forward, we find that that increasingly exacerbates the relationship politically between the East and the West. So that now the West begins to view this quasi-political leader in the Pope as a bit of a threat to their claim to be the exclusive Roman emperor. You see, that kind of problem. That heats up. And so by the time we get to Pope Leo IX, who is the Pope from 1049 to 1054, it's pretty much become an open and overt conflict between the East and the West. Here he is. He doesn't look that bad, does he? But that's Pope Leo IX. He plays a kind of political trump card that's called the donation of Constantine. The donation of Constantine is, by everybody's reckoning, a forgery generated sometime in the 8th century that purports to be written by Constantine and purports to name by Constantine the Pope of Rome as the universal head of the church, and in a sense, at least by implication, the universal head of the world. Now, Constantine wouldn't have done that, but this document kind of comes floating into the picture, and Pope Leo uses it, like he serves that on the leadership in Constantinople and says, hey, Constantine did it, I'm the guy, I'm the one who really is supposed to be in the top position, you see. Well, the fellow in the East wasn't quite so ready to accept that, and so you've got that political wrangle, and then it's complicated by some theological differences. The most famous of these, without getting too technical, is called the Filioque controversy. Filioque is a Latin word, F-I-L-I-O-Q-U-E. Filioque, really. It means and the Son. And it was a dispute over the Nicene Creed and whether the Nicene Creed should say that the Holy Spirit was sent by the Father or by the Father and the Son. Now that may or may not seem like a huge issue. It actually is a pretty important issue in terms of Trinitarian theology. But just because of the circumstances of the day, that became a bit of a lightning rod for the conflict between the East and the West and certain other points. So that finally the whole thing culminates in 1054 when both sides excommunicated the other. You know, that's what you do. If you don't like what somebody's doing to you and you've got the authority, you just excommunicate them. So it's a mutual excommunication, you know. The Pope excommunicates the leadership in Constantinople and he returns the favor. And that year, 1054, marks the moment when there is an official split of the church between East and West. There had been a de facto split already. Now it becomes de jure. It becomes a true political split, and it has never been healed. So you know that all of the Orthodox churches, the Russian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenian Orthodox, all of these Orthodox churches have their tradition going back to this Eastern side. And of course, we have a healthy representation of Orthodox Christianity here in Spokane, because it's not just Eastern anymore, but that was where it split from the Western Church, which became called the Catholic Church. It was called the Catholic even up to that day. So anyway, that's when it happens. That's a fairly big deal. The next big split that occurs, of course, is 500 years later, and that's the Protestant Reformation, and that's a split in the West between Catholicism and the Protestant movement, of which we are a part. But this is the first of them, and it happens right about here. So there's point one. This is the first, at least, evidence I'm submitting for your consideration of the politicizing of the papacy. Second is what happens in the Holy Roman Empire. I'm just going to spend a moment on this one. But you recall we had Otto the Great. We looked at him last time. He dies in 973. He was crowned by the Pope, Holy Roman Emperor, but nevertheless he and the Pope had an ongoing conflict that only got worse with the successors. Remember that the Holy Roman Empire, in a sense, surrounds the Papal States. And so the emperor feels like he's the guy who should be calling the shots. He has all of this vast empire under his control, and even the Papal States is sort of a little province within it. The Pope, on the other hand, views himself as the kingmaker. And he's the one who should ultimately be calling the shots, you see, not only for the emperor, but for most of the leadership in the West. And so this continues to be an increasingly hostile relationship that culminates now toward the end of the 11th century with Pope Gregory VII, who died in 1085, and Henry IV, who is one of these Holy Roman emperors. And they begin to test each other's mettle. So the Pope and Henry are both pushing each other to assert their political power over the other. And it culminated in a mutual rejection of each other's authority, once again, you see. You seeing a pattern here? Well, the Pope has a trump card he can play against Henry, and he does it. He excommunicates Henry for his intransigence and impudence, and he places the entire Holy Roman Empire under interdict. Now, I don't know if you know that term, but interdict is a papal pronouncement that a particular region is no longer able to celebrate legitimately the sacraments, which as a practical matter meant that all the people in the Holy Roman Empire who trusted the Pope's pronouncements believed that without a legitimate sacrament they were all basically doomed to go to hell. Now, if you can say that with a straight face and get people to believe it, it creates problems, you know. And all of a sudden, Henry has huge problems. Who's going to win this contest between the Pope and Henry? Up until then, it had been kind of an even conflict, but all of a sudden, Henry has to cave because he is facing the threat of a rebellion that will be absolutely uncontrollable by all of these faithful Catholics in the Holy Roman Empire who believe they've basically just been deprived of their salvation. So Henry is forced to cave. There's a famous incident. It's a pencil sketch of it here. He traipses across the Alps. He goes to the residence of the Pope, stands at the front door for 3 days in the snow barefoot, banging on the door, pleading with the Pope for forgiveness. It takes the Pope 3 days to finally give him forgiveness. But the message is clear. In a showdown between the Pope and the princes of Europe, the Pope wins. And now you have, really, as a practical matter, the Pope is the king of the West, you see. So I'm calling the 11th century the politicizing of the papacy, and at least this is some of my evidence in favor of that idea. Well, what's the next step? It leads us to then the Crusades. The Crusades begin right at the tail end of the 11th century and extend for about 3 centuries, as you know. I'm not going to treat them in detail this morning, but I do want to talk a little bit about what got them going. So we'll have to deal with the Crusades in several different discussions along the way, but this is just kind of the opening parlay here to kind of get us thinking about what's going on. What caused the Crusades? I want to approach this, well, let me put it this way. If you've had conversations with people trying to defend all the good that Christian people have done down through history, and you're winning the debate, inevitably your adversary is going to throw down the trump card, well, what about the Crusades, you know? And that's like, at that point, every Christian is supposed to bow his head in shame and walk away humbled because we had some part in the Crusades. And I appreciate that. The Crusades are not a pretty picture, and I'm not here to be a cheerleader for the Crusades, you know? So I want to say that on the one hand. On the other hand, there is a tendency to kind of paint in a broad brush what actually happened at that time and not to really appreciate within the intricacies of the moment why the Crusades occurred. And so for whatever it's worth to us, let's at least have some idea what's going on. It is the expression of a political pope, to be sure. So I'll just grant you that. But there's still more to the story, and I want to make sure we've at least thought about that a little bit. This is still superficial, but hopefully it'll be helpful. What are the Crusades about? Well, obviously Islam is part of the story. So if I may, let me give you the broadest sketch of Islamic history. Let's put this in a context. If you think about the history of Islam from its beginnings to the present day, then I think it's safe to say that you can divide it up roughly into 3 big chapters organized around 3 important cities. The first of these is the city of Mecca. You remember in 730, Muhammad defeated and conquered Mecca. We talked about that some weeks back. He died 2 years later, but Mecca was established at that point as the holiest city of Islam. And inspired by the Prophet, Islam grew explosively for the next 100 years. We looked at this some weeks back, so I'll just remind you briefly. They went up east to to India, the border of India, eastern Turkey, down through the Holy Land, the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, west across North Africa, up into Spain, you remember all that. And finally, their incursion into France is only stopped by the grandfather of Charlemagne, Charles Martel, at the Battle of Tours, 732, 100 years after the death of Muhammad. So the Mecca chapter is a chapter of explosive growth, much of which happens at the point of a sword. Forced conversions, and it's very, very successful, you see. So you have that chapter then gives way in the next chapter to another city, Baghdad. And by about the year 750, the central kind of cultural capital of the Islamic world is no longer Mecca. Mecca is still in the holy city, but the action now is in Baghdad. Baghdad is in Iraq, you know, Mesopotamia. And this lasts for about 700 years until the founding of the Ottoman Empire, which will come sometime later. So what's going on here? This chapter can be subdivided into 2 eras. The first era taking us up to the beginning of the Crusades, and the second era, really the time during the Crusades. The first era is a time in which Baghdad is the most advanced city in the world. Scientific progress, mathematical progress, all kinds of inventions. This is a time when Baghdad looks they're so far out in front of Europe, maybe not so much in the Far East. China had some pretty good stuff going on as well, but at this point Baghdad, at least from our point of view, has really capitalized on a great deal of learning from the ancient world and so on. And it gives rise to a whole legendary kind of collection of stories and lore, flying carpets, the Arabian Nights, that kind of thing. What is all that? It's all kind of the legendary memory of the time when Baghdad was just miles ahead of everybody else. We in the West are mired, we're still fighting barbarians and going through plagues and things. Meanwhile, it seems as if Baghdad is so far out in front. But it's also characteristic of this time that they are not overly hostile to the Christian West. So just keep your eye on that. Let's round this out, then we'll come back to that theme. The third capital is Istanbul. So that city that started as Byzantium and then became Constantinople, became Istanbul, the name it has to this day, in 1453, and that becomes the date of the founding of what's called the Ottoman Empire. So that's the third chapter. And the Ottoman Empire survives until they joined the wrong side of the First World War. Remember that? And then they got dismantled, and the mandates of France and Britain divided up big chunks of the Ottoman Empire, and it no longer existed. So there's kind of the big picture of Islam. I'm interested in that little slice, which is the first half of the period involving Baghdad. What's going on during that period? It's the years from maybe 800 to 1000. Christian pilgrimage is fairly common. That is to say, Christian people are able, and indeed often do if they're able to and have the finances and so on, to make trips to the holy precincts of the Holy Land, to Jerusalem in particular. And so you have this kind of vision, a sort of, we all have images like this, where these pilgrims would go on these journeys. The Islamic world was not hostile to that. Indeed, they welcomed it. Tourism is good for the economy. And so from the Islamic point of view, the more pilgrims, the better. And these people would come in, they'd buy trinkets, they'd buy souvenirs, and so from the Islamic point of view, no problemo. These people came in and it was kind of an interesting sort of happy relationship. I don't want to overstate this because there was still conflict, so those of you who really know your history know I'm kind of being a little bit carried away here, but there was a general tranquility during these years. And indeed, there was a recognition in the Christian West that the Islamic world really was accomplishing some good things, some advances in science, and really some appreciation that they were kind of out in front. All right. That all lasted until a group of Islamic warriors called the Seljuk Turks came on the scene. The Seljuk Turks, I was hesitant to make this analogy, but I think it's a fair one, are sort of like the ancient version of Al-Qaeda. They were traditional, militant Islamic forces who really wanted to get back into what they viewed to be the spirit of Muhammad himself, who was a warrior. And they believed that Islam had become soft, especially in its cordial relationship with the Christian West. And so the Seljuk Turks, who came from the east, from eastern parts of Turkey and parts even further east, came on the scene, and they were hardline, militant, Islamic characters, and so they came looking like warriors. And they viewed as enemies not only Christians, they even viewed their own Muslim compatriots there as the enemy. And so they came in, they drove out the more moderate Muslims. They really came through with a sweeping war of conquest, and they basically paralyzed this pilgrimage that had been going on between East and West. people, the pilgrims, many of them were killed. There was bloodshed, there was battle, there was loss of life, and you can just imagine pilgrimage stopped right there, creating a certain degree of frustration in the West and a sort of new vision about what are these Islamic people all about. We thought we'd sort of come to terms with them, and now we have this new development. The Seljuk Turks swept across the entire Islamic world until they reached the Hellespont, that waterway that separates Asia from Europe, and just across on the other side is the city of Constantinople. So all of a sudden, the leadership in Constantinople is looking across the waterway and seeing a bunch of very militant Islamic warriors who seem to be ready to get onto a bridge or a boat or something and come over and take over Constantinople. So the emperor in Constantinople sends a bunch of panicked emails to the Pope. Now there was an earlier Pope, Clement, who didn't really respond favorably, but the Pope who was interested in getting on the bandwagon here and really flexing his political muscle was named Urban II. And so he gets this appeal for help from the East. Oddly enough, ironically enough, the very East that had excommunicated the Pope a few years earlier, now you see pleading for help. And the Pope, who does have a fairly exaggerated opinion of the papal office, thinks this is a great opportunity to not only do something that seems very legitimate, truly what we might call a just war, to send military forces to defend Constantinople, but he also sees beyond that the possibility of reopening access to the city of Jerusalem and reinstituting once again the prospect of pilgrimage. So the Pope sees this as a kind of opportunity. I don't think all his motives were all that virtuous, but I think at least some of them were. I guess that's what I want to say here is, given the position he was in, I can see why he might have made this decision. He was facing a certain amount of the need for something like this because he had in the feudal system, the lower classes that were by far the majority were in many ways almost reduced to slave status. It was a tough way of life, and many of them wanted to have some new adventure, some new way of escaping feudalism. He had beyond that had a kind of restless warrior class, because all of these knights who had once been employed fighting barbarians were all dressed up with nowhere to go anymore, and they spent most of their time fighting each other. And the Pope was concerned that he was seeing all of these intramural conflicts between different fiefdoms, and he wanted to give these guys something to go do that would be a little more constructive, aside beating themselves up. And so he has a restless population, a restless warrior class, and he's a restless Pope himself. He has this political power that he's been able to achieve based on recent events of the last 50 years or so. And so he's really at an optimum moment to do what he does, and that is to call for a crusade. You see, in 1095, Urban II preaches more than once, but one time in particular, these powerful sermons calling for people to join in a great crusade to rescue our brother Christians over in the East and to otherwise accomplish some good things. And that gives rise then to what is this era of the Crusades. The early history of the Crusades, I'll just touch this very briefly. There is what I like to call the zeroth crusade. This was the crusade before the First Crusade. It was a tragic, unhappy, misguided effort inspired by two guys, both of whom were fairly strange. One, Peter the Hermit, and the other, Walter the Penniless. If you ever have an appeal from two guys and their names are Peter the Hermit and Walter the Penniless, you want to be on your guard, this. But anyway, they go out, they inspire among the peasantry a huge commitment. There were all kinds of promises. God is going to bless us. We will be successful. It'll be like Jericho, and Joshua and all of this. And so all of these who are looking for an excuse to escape anyway, join this movement. And off they go. They don't have training, they don't have equipment, they don't have any kind of military horsepower of any kind, and basically it is a complete and total catastrophe. Most of these people are killed. Many of the rest are sold as slaves, very few escape, and the whole thing was just an abysmal, colossal failure. So that's the 0th crusade. That was kind of the warm-up. The first crusade was much better organized, and there were actually competent military minds that went into this one. So it started in 1096. 1097, they took the city of Nicaea. They're in central Turkey, which we've looked at before in connection with the Nicene Council. In 1098, they laid siege to Antioch, north of Jerusalem there, for 7 months. Antioch fell. In 1099, Jerusalem fell. So there was a stated objective that was realized. It was ugly. It was a bloodbath. It was an embarrassment. Many of the people in Jerusalem, Islamic, were slaughtered, including women and children. There's no apology for it here. It was just bad, you know. But anyway, it was successful militarily. And it did reopen access to Jerusalem and put Jerusalem under Christian control. So at least from a military perspective, a political perspective, that first crusade was successful. The second crusade, interestingly, the chief personality associated with the second crusade is our friend Bernard of Clairvaux. And so this may come as a surprise to you that the man who wrote hymns like "O Sacred Head Now Wounded" was also one of the great cheerleaders for the Second Crusade. It's just history. All I can do is report it to you and give you my assessment of it. But anyway, he is probably the most famous guy associated with this. The crusade itself is largely a failure, but it does give me an excuse now to take a few minutes and try to treat briefly with you the career and person of Bernard of Clairvaux. And I just want to ask you, don't hold this connection to the Second Crusade against him yet. You know, kind of work with me here, because there's a whole lot in this man to admire. And this may have been I think he himself realized before it was over it was a grave miscalculation, but in the spirit of the times, he was kind of drawn into it himself. So, Bernard of Clairvaux. He was born in 1090, right at the end of the 11th century, died in 1153. At the time of his death, I would say the universal opinion of all who were familiar with his career at all would have said that he was the most remarkable man of his age. When you think about the Crusades and the era of the Crusades, there's three personalities typically that come to mind. The early Crusades, Bernard of Clairvaux. The middle era, Francis of Assisi. The latter part of the Crusades, Thomas Aquinas. We're going to look at all three of them. So he's the first of these dominant personalities that are related to the era of the Crusades. And as I say, he was quite a remarkable guy. There are many descriptions of him personally. This is strictly a kind of typical example in which one contemporary wrote of Bernard, quote, "In his countenance there shone forth a pureness not of earth but of heaven, and his eyes had a clearness of an angel's, and the mildness of a dove's eyes." And you have enough sort of descriptions of him that you must think this man must have had a commanding kind of personal presence. And there was a kind of sense of weight about him that I think certainly impressed many of his contemporaries. He had multiple areas where he was prominent and indeed genius. He was, by every account, the greatest preacher of his age. And his preaching was, if you read his sermons, quite evangelical, we would say. It wasn't just preaching moralism or some such thing. He really was reaching for the heart of people and trying to turn them to a love for and faith in Christ. And that just runs through his sermons, through his writings, through his poetry, so deeply, so conspicuously, you just can't miss it. His preaching was powerful. It would be something like the Great Awakening with George Whitefield or Jonathan Edwards, you know, where you just have people just weeping and lamenting and sensing their sin and crying out to repent, that kind of thing. Very emotional responses to a very powerful preacher. He was a most important advisor to the several popes who came along during his reign. But don't get me wrong, when I say advisor, I don't mean he was in their back pocket. He has some very choice things to say to some of the popes, and it does give you a feeling for where the papacy was. Just one typical quote from one letter he wrote to a pope in which he said, quote, "You are despicable. In all circumstances, you know no law but your pleasure. You never think of God, nor do you fear him." So Bernard was an advisor to the pope, you know what I'm saying. But his advice could be brutal. He was a courageous man. And he was such a weighty force in the Christian world that, there was no messing with him. So he spoke his mind, and he spoke it with great truth. And it does give us some sense of where even people like Bernard viewed the papacy by the time of his life, that it really deteriorated to something much less than what it once had been and certainly should have been. He did, as I say, organize the Second Crusade. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. He developed, as I told you earlier, an elaborate system of mysticism, or what I would prefer to call a devotional Christianity. By this time, I think you'd say the mainstream of Christian practice had become somewhat externalized, ritualized, and there was not a lot of focus on the state of the heart. That certainly hadn't been the case earlier, but by the time we reach this point, at least the general evidence is that church or Christian practice was more or less kind of an externalized affair, and Bernard is the one who wants to give us back the heart of what it is to be a Christian. It is not just what you do. It's somehow down deep where you feel things. He's not just a subjectivist or something, but there is a deep, heartfelt love for Christ that he's trying to inspire in those that come under his ministry. And he did this by certain rather well worked out disciplines of devotional life and prayer and so on, and that was a very important part of his contribution as well. He revitalized monastic life. It had really sunk along kind of with the declining moral weightiness of the papacy. You'd say the monastic life in general had also begun to decline. There were certain monastic reformers that came along. The Cluniac reform, we'll talk about later, was important in kind of trying to revitalize the monastic life, but Bernard was very important in that connection as well. He wrote some of the church's most enduring hymns, and as I say, I'm assuming every one of us in this room have sung at least some of his hymns. Maybe his most significant compliment I can pay him is that both Luther and Calvin loved him. And they were not overly keen on medieval Christianity. They weren't guys who were overly lavish in congratulating the central spirits of the medieval era. But both of them unite in saying that Bernard of Clairvaux stood out in a class by himself, and they both lavished praise upon him. His life I can detail fairly quickly for you. He was born into a knightly family in France, in the Frankish kingdom. So it's to the west on that map you've seen in the past. His father was a knight. His father was part of the nobility. His father had 6 sons. Bernard was the oldest, and 1 daughter. He lost his mother when he was 15 years old. So it was basically the dad that had reared these boys. And of course, the father assumed that they were all going to join him as part of the military class of France at that time in this feudal kind of arrangement. So that was the expectation. However, when Bernard was 22 years old, quite to the shock of his father, Bernard said to his father, "God is calling me to become a monk." Dad was not happy because monks didn't have a great reputation by this point. They had had better reputations at other times. At this point, they were not necessarily celebrated as heroic characters, and the dad said that classic line, "You're throwing your life away," kind of thing. And Bernard reminded his father that his father's wife's dying wish 7 years earlier would be that Bernard would give his life to the service of God, because Bernard was already such a conspicuous, devoted Christian. Dad kind of softened up at the recollection of Mom's dying wish, and so reluctantly but sincerely gave his blessing to his son. You may be interested in knowing, over time, the other 5 brothers joined Bernard, and eventually so did the dad as monks, so that was the effect of his commitment on them. But anyway, he joined what was called the Cistercian order at 22 years of age. He so distinguished himself so rapidly that only 3 years later, he was commissioned by the Pope to establish a new monastery in a place that was called the Valley of Wormwood. It was kind of a swampy, ugly, forbidding no man's land. And that's where Bernard wanted to go and transform it and create there this monastery. And so he went there with about a half a dozen, or I think it was a dozen monks, and they gave themselves to tilling the land. I mean, it was just nothing but hard work, you know. I spent 15 minutes yesterday doing some hard work in the yard, and it cured me right there. But he devoted himself for some years, and so the place was transformed from being the Valley of Wormwood to the name Clairvaux, which means clear valley. And there were many who commented on it. One contemporary described it in these words: "At first glance, as you enter, after coming down the hill, you can feel that God is in the place. The silent valley speaks in the simplicity of its buildings and the true humility of the men of Christ living there. The silence is only broken by the music of singing or the sound of the hoe in the garden. I marveled and thought I saw a new heaven and a new earth." And you have to credit really the genius of Bernard as just an administrator, along with, of course, the effects of God's grace at work to accomplish that kind of transformation. By the time that Bernard died in 1153, he was absolutely the most famous man of his age. That was what kind of impact that he had. His ministry was always focused on Christ. I don't know how to say this and not have it sound trite. We hear these words and we think, okay, yeah, he was a minister. No. This man explored relationship with Christ, deep, personal, heartfelt, loving relationship with the risen Christ in a way that you would just virtually not find a precedent for it in the history of the church. And that's what won the hearts, the skeptical hearts, I might add, of people like Luther and Calvin. When they read Bernard, they couldn't escape the power of the sense of devotion that they found in Bernard toward Christ. Martin Luther himself has some interesting quotes. He said of Bernard, "Bernard is superior to all the doctors in his sermons, even to Augustine himself, because he preaches Christ most excellently." Luther said, "Bernard loved Jesus as much as any man can." Luther said, "Bernard was the greatest Christian of the Middle Ages." So that's the kind of impact that this man had. He did help to organize the Second Crusade, so just a word about this. This is kind of a map of what happened. It was not successful. It was, in fact, an abysmal failure. So the first thing to get on the table is whatever talents Bernard had, this was not one point where we saw very much of them. But a couple of things even here are worth noting. If you're familiar with the Crusades, you know that one of the unfortunate aspects of it, one of many, is that there was also a great deal of anti-Jewish kind of activity, in which many times Jewish villages were assaulted and destroyed and so on. And when that first happened, Bernard certainly didn't authorize it. He wasn't even aware of it. When he learned of it, he traveled immediately on horseback to the very place where these things were happening and rose up in a very courageous and rather lonely protest and said to the people responsible for this that what they were doing was an abominable sin, that the Jewish people were to be respected, that even though they didn't share our faith, they had at one time been God's chosen people. And Bernard preached a sermon saying he fully believed that the time was coming when these Jewish people would recognize Christ and embrace Him as Lord, and we need to preserve and protect them until such a day comes. That was the content of the message he brought. So whatever bad things we know of in the Crusades in terms of anti-Semitism, we can't blame Bernard for it. He did all, and he with quite a bit of good effect, at least at that time. The other thing that happened in Bernard's experience was he was able to visit Jerusalem, and this was the point where he really did seem to have discovered in some new and rich way the humanity of Christ. The Stations of the Cross, he enriched the whole understanding of the Via Dolorosa, and all of this theology that had been there but had not been as well developed was richly expanded by Bernard of Clairvaux. The humanity of Christ is probably one of the great contributions theologically he made. Remember, the church up until this time has been heavy on the deity of Christ because they've been fighting Arianism and they've been fighting the Islamic religion, both of whom, you see, would emphasize his humanity but deny his deity. Bernard now comes along, granting the deity of Christ, and really wants to rediscover richly and significantly the humanity of Christ. And that, in some ways, might be one of his great additional contributions. There are widespread reports connected with Bernard of Clairvaux of miracle. I don't have a solid opinion either way. I just want to report to you that the reports are so widespread, even from people who weren't great supporters of Bernard, that you have to wonder if there wasn't something to it. Even Bernard himself in his writings, while he never says much about it, seems to tacitly grant, and he himself expresses some surprise at the fact that there seem to be these miraculous incidents, mainly healings of unexpected variety. So I just report that to you. It's certainly part of his story. I'm much a product of my age as you are, and so we tend to be skeptical about these things, but in the case of Bernard, I think there's probably something to it. His most famous hymn, of course, O Sacred Head Now Wounded, another, Jesus, the Very Thought of Thee, many other hymns. If you just glance in the hymn book, you'll notice that there's several really pretty well-known hymns attributed. His theology was ahead of his time. My own opinion is if he'd lived 300 or 400 years later, he would have been one of the reformers. Again, who knows, but I think he was skeptical enough of the Pope in his day that he probably could have shared something of Luther's view. He defended the Trinity against the liberal nominalist skeptic Abelard, who was his contemporary, so he was deeply committed to the Reformed, not Reformed, but the classical Orthodox tradition going back to Nicaea. He shared and seemed to express quite deeply Augustine's view of the incapacity of the human will to choose God unless first acted on sovereignly by grace. And so we would say that he was a Calvinist before Calvin. He was certainly in the rich the rich tradition of Augustine that became the Reformed tradition. And so at least at that point, we share a lot in common with his theological perspective. He denied the Immaculate Conception of Mary. By this time, there was a widespread belief that Mary herself was sinless and had been exempted from original sin by what was called an Immaculate Conception. And Bernard denied that. He thought that was not only not biblical, but not reasonable, and that Jesus was as much the Savior of Mary as of anybody else that trusts in Christ for salvation. So again, he would share that more with the Reformers than with the Catholic view of his day. He denied that baptism was indispensable to salvation. There was a widespread view by this point that in order to be saved, you just got to be baptized, and it's got to be, within the legitimate church. And he was the one who shifted the focus and said it's a matter of faith. Baptism may anticipate faith in the case of infant baptism. It may confirm faith in the case of adult baptism, but still the critical thing is there faith? Baptism is important. It's absolutely essential, Bernard would say, in terms of the normal practice of the church, but it is not the instrumental cause of salvation. It is faith, and that was an emphasis as well. He did affirm the centrality of sincere love, and that became one of the most conspicuous themes. And I just want to leave you here with this will be my Sunday school lesson and devotional thought in this lesson, because I need to sneak out of here pretty quick because I'm helping out in the second service. So I'm going to leave you with these lovely words from Bernard, words you're familiar with from this famous hymn. Jesus, the very thought of thee with sweetness fills my breast. But sweeter far thy face to see, and in thy presence rest. Nor voice can sing, nor heart can frame, nor can the memory find a sweeter sound than thy blessed name, O Savior of mankind. O hope of every contrite heart, O joy of all the meek, to those who fall, how kind thou art, how good to those who seek. But what to those who find? Ah, this no tongue nor pen can show, the love of Jesus, what it is. None but his loved ones know.